right candidates, see your job posts, and apply. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
So to start, my family history is very tragic. My parents got into a serious car accident when I was a little kid, and my dad passed away in the hospital from his injuries. My mom had lasting injuries that still affect her, making it difficult for her to walk. My dad left us the house that my mom and I continued to live in for many years to come. Eventually, my mom started seeing someone when I was around 10, so she'd be out of the house quite often. My uncle Steve would often stay at the house for days at a time while she was gone, and I got really close with him. He was my babysitter of sorts for a long time. He was always a cool uncle. He'd play catch with me in the yard, he'd take care of our pets, he'd take me to the movies, stuff like that any kid needs. Memories I didn't get to form with my dad, unfortunately. As the years went on and I got older, my mom got married to her second husband, and my uncle Steve would come around less and less. By the time I was 16, there was a period where he just didn't come over for months and I didn't hear from him. My mom was comfortable leaving me home alone at this point, so I didn't question it too much, and having the house to myself was always nice as a teenager. My mom would be home a couple nights a week for dinner, but for the most part, she lived with her husband. My mom was always very vague about what happened to my Uncle Steve. I had my suspicions that he was sick or dead, though. It may sound weird that my mom would hide something like that from me, but if you met my mom, you'd get it instantly. Because of what she went through, I think it made her a much more compassionate person that doesn't want to cause any kind of stress or grief toward another person. By the time I turned 18, I was a legal adult and the house was basically mine. My mom would visit occasionally, but she and her husband had already gotten another house together. As an 18-year-old guy having a house to myself, you can imagine that I wasn't complaining. Yes, I'd have friends over for late nights, yes, I'd have girls over, and yes, I'd often not pick things up off the floor for days at a time. I would miss my Uncle Steve though, as he was the father figure that I grew up with, and there were times where being in a big empty house by myself at such a young age was kind of lonely and depressing. I would numb this feeling often by, I guess, doing the things I just mentioned, having girls over and late nights with friends. I still had my dog Jojo, the only other life in the house really. He was an Australian Shepherd, and at the time of this story, he was 13 years old. He was an old man. He always slept by my side in bed, but one night in January, I remember this because the Christmas tree was still up, I woke up and Jojo wasn't in bed. I got up thinking he was downstairs somewhere and he had to go to the bathroom. I called his name as I walked down the stairs. I didn't hear him, so I walked to the kitchen where the basement stairs and back door were, and I saw him in the dark. He was staring intently down the basement stairs. I usually left that door open because it was a bitch to close. He only moved when he turned his head to look at me for a second, but then he looked right back down the stairs. I stepped to the edge of the stairs and then looked at Jojo and said, "What is it, boy?" His tail started wagging just a bit for a second, then went stiff again. I flicked on the light in the basement and looked down the stairs. Jojo inched closer but didn't bark. I felt a cold shiver run down me as I looked down into the basement. Of all places for your dog to stare down like this, the basement is the worst place. I turned off the light and grabbed Jojo by the collar to bring him upstairs. I shut the door so he couldn't leave again. Was I creeped out? Yes, a little. It was unusual behavior for him. I was mainly asking myself what he could have heard. I tried to go back to sleep. At this point, my mind was kind of racing though, and it didn't help that every few minutes or so, I would hear and feel the vibration on the bed as Jojo would look up at the doorway, as if still hearing something from downstairs. I decided I would investigate. I wasn't going to be a mama's boy and text my mom at whatever off hour in the night it was telling her I'm scared. Part of not having a father figure in the house when you're young is becoming a man early on. I went downstairs again, and by the time I was at the bottom, I heard Jojo walking down following me. Jojo then caught up to me and went straight for the basement door again. Then he stopped in the same position as last time. I stopped alongside him and looked down the stairs to the darkness again. I can't believe I did this, but I called down the stairs, saying, "Is someone there?" I flicked on the light when there was no response. I started walking down the steps, each one creaking beneath me. I hated those old steps. You couldn't see into the basement until you were about halfway down the stairs, as the ceiling was low. I was on maybe the third step when I heard the voice. It was my uncle's voice. I knew it right away, all these years later. It was my uncle's voice from somewhere in the basement, saying my name, only it sounded weak, like he was injured. I ran down to the basement as my heart dropped out of me. I got to the bottom, and it was just an empty basement. "Uncle Steve?" I called out. Jojo was still at the top of the stairs looking down at me. He didn't want to come down. I walked further into the basement, and there was nobody there. My heart was beating 100 beats per minute at this moment. I peeked behind the couch and even behind the TV. There was nowhere else for anyone to be besides the laundry room, which was in the corner. I took one look into the corner, and I thought I heard the slightest sound on the other side of the door. That's when something just came over my entire body, where I had to sprint upstairs like a little kid and get out of there. When I got to the top step, I didn't even shut the light. I struggled to just close the basement door and then run upstairs. Poor old Jojo barked the first barks I'd heard from him in months. He followed behind as fast as he could as I went upstairs. First thing I did was lock us in my room. Then I called my mom over and over until she picked up. When she did, I was whisper screaming into the phone, telling her someone's down in the basement and it sounded just like Uncle Steve. In fact, I knew it was Uncle Steve. I told her that Jojo was at the basement door when I woke up, after he obviously heard something too. My mom was surprisingly calm and just let me finish. When I finished, I waited for her to say something in panic or anything, but she just said in a gentle, calm voice that I probably just woke up from a bad dream. I doubled down and swore to her that someone was down there. Even Jojo knew it. I asked her if she thought I would just make that up. This is where she paused for a second, and it's because this was the moment she decided to tell me the truth, that my Uncle Steve got sick with cancer and died years ago, and that's why he stopped coming over. Before she could finish her explanation, I told her it's not possible. He's down in the basement right now. She then stopped me and said, "Listen to me. If someone's in the basement, you need to call the cops right now." So that's what I did. I hung up, dialed 911, and told them of a break-in. Jojo and I waited in my bedroom until there was a knock at the front door, followed by the doorbell. I ran downstairs to let them in and eagerly pointed them to the basement. The basement door was still basically jammed shut like I left it. They told me to wait up there, but I didn't listen. I insisted on going down with them. I reenacted everything as we went down, what I heard, when, and where. Then I showed them where I looked around, and then I pointed to the one spot I didn't check, the laundry room, where I heard the sound. They went to open the door, and I showed them the light switch. When the light turned on, there was no one inside. The laundry room looked how it always looked. There was no one hiding in any secret crevices or behind the machines, nothing. It was as void of people as could be before we came in. I knew I was looking crazy right about now. We went back upstairs, and they did a little search of the first floor as well, then the upstairs. The house was as clear as it could be. There was no one there. They were at least pretty level-headed and not demeaning about it, even though they probably thought I was a whack job. They left, and I went back upstairs to call my mom again. She picked up right away, and this is where she finished explaining. My Uncle Steve died years ago, but she didn't want to tell me because she knew I suffered enough loss, and she couldn't bring herself to tell me. So she just played it off like my uncle kinda disappeared, which I yelled at her was infinitely worse, but that also didn't explain my hearing his voice just now in the basement. I calmed down, and then said into the phone, "Mom, I'm scared." She believed what I heard, I know it, and that scared me even more. She tried to convince me everything would be alright, and that my brain was playing tricks on me. I pretended to agree. We hung up, and I pulled Jojo close to me. He was the only thing keeping me from freaking out of my skin that night. I didn't fall asleep for another few hours. For a whole week after that, life in that house was hell. I couldn't go anywhere near that basement door. Jojo wouldn't stare at it anymore, but it was still haunting. I know it was all real because Jojo was reacting to something. Had Jojo not been there, I could have played it off as a late-night hallucination or mind tricks. But no, someone or something was down there. Something that had my uncle's voice. My mom sold that house just a year later. This happened when I was 24 and renting the upstairs of an old house by myself. It wasn't technically an apartment, it was more like the second floor had been turned into its own little living space years ago. There was a bedroom, bathroom, tiny kitchen, and a living room, and the landlord lived out of state, so I almost never saw him. The first floor was empty and had been for months because he was supposedly renovating it before renting it out again. That part always made me a little uneasy because it meant every night I was sleeping above a completely dark, empty floor of the house. Still, the rent was cheap, and I told myself I was being dramatic. For the first few weeks, nothing happened. Then one night, around 1 in the morning, while I was in bed doom-scrolling, I heard what sounded like a single footstep directly below me. It was so clear that I actually froze and waited for another one. A few seconds later, I heard another. It sounded exactly like someone slowly walking through the first-floor living room. I sat up in bed and just listened. I remember thinking maybe it was the house settling, but it didn't sound like that. Old house noises usually had more of a creak or a pop to them. This sounded heavier, like actual weight pressing on floorboards. I stayed still for a long time, then finally convinced myself it had to be nothing. The next day, I checked the first floor on my way out. It was locked. I even opened it and looked inside. The place was empty and dusty, with no furniture except for an old broken table in one room. I felt stupid for being unsettled. The next night, nothing happened. The night after that, it happened again. This time, it started at around 12:30. It was the same thing. Slow footsteps below me. 3 or 4 at a time, then silence, then a few more. It lasted maybe 2 minutes. I muted my TV and stood in the middle of my living room listening down through the floor. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe an animal got in. Maybe pipes somehow sounded like that in this house. But deep down, I knew it sounded like a person moving around. I texted my friend Scott about it, and he made a joke that the downstairs tenant had finally moved in. Over the next week, it kept happening. It was always late at night and always from downstairs. Sometimes it was footsteps, but once it sounded like a cabinet door shutting. That was the first time I got genuinely scared enough to call the landlord. He sounded annoyed more than concerned. He said no one had keys except him and me, and he was out of state. He told me old homes make weird noises, and said if I was really nervous, I could call the police, but he didn't think there was any reason to. That response actually made me more uncomfortable, because now I felt like if something was wrong, I was on my own. One Friday night, I was out later than usual, and didn't get home until almost 2. The second I stepped into my upstairs apartment, I felt something was off. I don't know how else to explain it. Nothing looked different, and the lights were off like I'd left them. But something felt different. I stood for a second listening, and everything was quiet. But then directly below me, I heard a thud. It sounded like something had bumped into a wall or a piece of furniture downstairs. I backed up so fast I almost tripped on the rug. I remember just standing there staring at the floor like I could somehow see through it. Then came more footsteps. I left immediately and sat in my car with the doors locked. I actually called the police that time. 2 officers came and checked the whole first floor and outside of the house. They found nothing. One of them said there was no sign of forced entry and no one inside. He was polite about it, but I could tell they both thought I had gotten worked up over house noises. For the next few days, I kept thinking maybe they were right. Then I started noticing little things. Once, I came home from work and the first floor door was open by maybe an inch. I knew I closed it after the police were there. Another time, I smelled cigarette smoke outside the side of the house near one of the downstairs windows. I don't smoke, and neither do any of my nearby neighbors, at least not from what I knew. Then one night, I heard the footsteps again, only this time they stopped directly beneath my bedroom. I was lying in bed, and it sounded like whoever it was standing still in the room below me. I held my breath and listened. After maybe 10 seconds, I heard a very light tapping sound. 3 taps, then silence. I can't explain the feeling going through my body at that point. It felt like I was being watched in that moment, even though that made no logical sense. I grabbed my phone and texted my friend asking if I could come stay at his place. While I was waiting for him to answer, I heard the tapping again. 3 more taps in the same spot. I left without even changing clothes. The next day, my friend came back with me because I didn't want to be there alone. We checked the whole place and again found nothing, but when we got to the downstairs kitchen, he crouched near one of the lower cabinets and said, "What is that?" There was a cigarette butt jammed way in the back under the cabinet toe kick, almost hidden. It looked fresh. That instantly made everything real for me. Somebody had been in there. At that point, I stopped caring if I sounded paranoid. I called the landlord again and told him exactly what we found. He seemed more concerned this time and said he'd drive over the next day. That night, I stayed somewhere else. When he got there the following afternoon, he called me and said there was nothing obvious, but one of the back windows downstairs didn't lock right. It looked closed, but from outside, it could be forced up enough for a thin person to get in. He said maybe somebody local had figured that out and was using the empty first floor when no one was around. Hearing that made me feel sick. I asked him if he was going to fix it right away, and he said yes, but I'd already decided I was done. What really pushed me over the edge happened that same evening when I went back one last time to get some clothes and my laptop. I was upstairs stuffing things into a duffel bag when I heard a sound come from below that I hadn't heard before. It was a cough, and there was no mistaking it. It came from the first floor hallway. For about 2 seconds, I just stood there digesting what I just heard. Then I grabbed the bag and ran out so fast I left half my stuff there. I called the cops again from my car. This time they actually found evidence someone had been coming in. Near the back window, there were fresh marks and dirt on the sill, and in a closet downstairs, they found an old blanket I had never seen before. I moved out that weekend. Ever since then, any sound in the house at night hits me differently. My name is Chris, and this happened when I was 22. I was living in the upstairs of a mother-daughter house owned by our parents, with my older brother Tom living downstairs. The setup was pretty simple. My part of the house upstairs was one big open space for the living room, kitchen, and dining area, then a hallway that led to the bathroom, a spare bedroom I used as a big walk-in closet, and my bedroom at the end. Tom had his own separate entrance downstairs, and we had a door that connected the 2 floors from inside. It worked out well because we had our own space but could still get to each other if needed. One week, Tom went to Mexico with his fiancée, so I had the whole place to myself. The night in question started completely normal. I got home around 7, threw something on TV, and started cooking dinner. Chicken and rice, something simple that didn't require much attention. I had the TV going in the background, and everything was normal. Around the time I was cleaning up, I thought I heard a noise from downstairs. I'm not sure how to describe it other than just a basic thud. Like it could have came from the wall, on the floor, I don't know. Just a thud. I stopped what I was doing and listened for a bit. I assumed it was something settling or something falling over slightly. The normal assumptions. The downstairs had been empty for a few days already since Tom left. Still, it felt random enough that I muted the TV and stood there for a bit. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't like the feeling of ignoring it. So I went over to the door that led downstairs, which was already open, and went down to check. I turned on the lights and walked through every room. His living room, kitchen, bedroom, and bathroom. Everything looked exactly how it should. So I went back upstairs, finished cleaning, put everything away, and then sat on the couch for a while watching TV. After maybe an hour or so, I got tired and decided to go to bed. It didn't take long for me to start drifting off. Then, out of the blue, I heard music start playing from the living room. It was loud enough to instantly wake me up. It took me a second to even process what I was hearing. It was coming from my Amazon Alexa on the counter in the kitchen area. The song itself was some kind of slow instrumental song I had never heard before. It had a sort of dark vibe to it. I yelled Alexa stop from my bed a couple times, but it didn't respond. I got more annoyed than anything and got out of bed, went into the hallway, and said Alexa stop louder. The music shut off right away. I looked at it for a second, pretty much knowing it was likely just a glitch. I went back into my room and got back into bed. A few minutes later, just as I was starting to fall asleep again, I heard the Alexa say, "Sorry, I didn't quite get that."
I'm having trouble understanding.
I got up again, walked into the living room, and unplugged it from the wall completely. I remember thinking that would be the end of it. Clearly that confirmed the thing was glitching out. I went back to my room, and this time I fell asleep pretty quickly. I don't know how much time passed, but I woke up suddenly to loud music again. It took me a second to even understand what was happening because I was still half asleep. Then it hit me. The music was coming from the living room again. I shot out of bed immediately because I remember unplugging the Alexa. There was no way it should have been on. I walked down the hallway slower this time. I didn't know what I was expecting to see, but I felt very uncomfortable now. I called out, "Alexa, stop," as I got closer, and the music shut off instantly. I then looked at the counter. The Alexa was plugged back into the wall. I just stood there staring at it for a few seconds. You would too if you were in the same situation. I knew without a doubt I unplugged it, unless I sleepwalked and plugged it back in. I remember pulling the cord out myself. There was no doubt about that. That's when that feeling in your stomach that something's really wrong hit me. I didn't check anything else because I was too scared. I turned and went straight back to my room and locked the door. Thank God it had a lock. I grabbed my phone and texted Tom asking if he came back early and was messing with me. But as I was typing, I saw at the top of the screen under his name, it said, "Location Mexico." If this didn't already seem weird, now this felt straight up like a nightmare. I pulled the chair over to the door so I could sit and listen for anything on the other side. I didn't hear anything at first. Everything was completely quiet. I stayed like that for probably 10 minutes with my ear up on the door. Then I heard something that I will never forget. From out in the living room, I heard a whisper. It was quiet, but clear enough to understand what it was. It said, "Alexa, play," and then something I couldn't make out. My entire body went numb. It was like all the weight dropped out of me at once. Before I could react, the Alexa responded, and music started blasting again from the living room. I don't think I've ever felt that kind of dreadful fear before. I grabbed my phone and called 911, but instead of being quiet about it, I just started yelling that I was calling 911 and telling whoever was out there to get the F out. I don't know why I did that. I think I just panicked. I was 22, scared, and defenseless. My first priority wasn't getting this person arrested, rather just getting them out. The music was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. I had no idea if the person was still out there or not. The operator answered, and I told them someone was in my house. When the song finally ended, I yelled, "Alexa, stop," again from inside my room. It worked. The cops showed up a few minutes later. I stayed in my room until they were inside and calling my name. When I came out, I explained everything as best I could. They checked the entire upstairs and then went downstairs too. After a few minutes, they came back and said there was no one in the house. I don't know if that made me feel good or bad. Good on one hand that the danger was gone, bad on the other that they got away. One of them told me that my front door was wide open when they got there. That front door was without a doubt locked, at the very least closed. That meant whoever it was had left through there, but it didn't explain how they got in. The officers eventually left after telling me to call again if anything else happened. I locked the front door, locked the door to the downstairs, and didn't sleep much the rest of that night. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about something. The downstairs apartment had been empty for days while Tom was gone. There was a part of me that couldn't shake the idea that someone might have been staying down there and just came upstairs that night to harass me and scare me. That thought bothered me more than anything else that actually happened, so I stayed at a friend's place the next night. When Tom got back 2 days later, I'd already told him everything. We went through both parts of the house again and didn't find anything obvious missing or out of place. My brother only believed me because I showed him proof of the police having come there. Otherwise, he'd have thought it was a joke to scare him. The first thing we did was install cameras around the house, front, back, and inside by both doors. Nothing like that happened after that. Eventually, our parents made us get our own apartment so they could rent that house out for extra income. In a weird way, I was happy to get out of there because when something like this happens, it sticks with you, and it becomes attached mentally to that place where it happened.